The first time I realized something was wrong was not when the gate key stopped working or when the HOA's laminated community standards notice appeared on my fence, but when a kid barely old enough to shave stood at the edge of my own pool with his chest puffed out, mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes, and told me, in a voice soaked with entitlement, that I needed to leave immediately because residents have priority access. The sun was blazing. The water was still, and I had just settled into that rare, peaceful quiet that comes when you think you've finally earned a moment to breathe. I stared at him, towel draped over my shoulder, boots sitting neatly by the pool deck, and for a second I honestly wondered if this was some kind of prank. This pool wasn't community property. It wasn't shared. It wasn't governed by the HOA's color-coded rulebook or their obsession with lawn heights and mailbox paint. This pool was on my land, behind my fence, paid for with my money, approved by the county, and inspected personally by me more times than I could count. But the kid didn't hesitate, gestured behind him, whereas Mother HOA Karen herself sat under an umbrella like a queen overseeing her court, sipping something pink and watching me with that tight, smug smile I'd come to recognize. Her son cleared his throat and repeated himself louder this time, like volume could replace authority, telling me that unauthorized use of community-adjacent amenities violated HOA Code 7.3 subsection B, and that failure to comply would result in consequences. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about rules. This was about power, or at least the illusion of it. I slowly looked past him, meeting Karen's gaze, saw the satisfaction in her posture, the way she leaned back as if the outcome was already decided. I had moved into this neighborhood for the quiet, for the land, for the distance from nonsense like this. But Karen had made it her mission from day one to remind everyone that her HOA presidency made her untouchable. She'd find veterans for flag placement, harassed widows over trash bins, once threatened a foreclosure over mismatched flower pots. Everyone whispered about her, no one challenged her. And now, apparently, she had trained her son to act as her personal enforcer. The kid took a step closer to the pool, blocking the ladder like a bouncer at a cheap club, and told me again to leave, adding that if I didn't, he'd escalate the situation. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I felt that familiar tightening in my jaw, the one that came from years of keeping my temper under control, from knowing when to stay calm and when to let someone dig their own grave. I asked him very politely whose pool he thought this was. He smirked and said it didn't matter, because the HOA had authority over everything within the development boundary. That was rich. This land had been here long before the development, before the HOA signs, before Karen and her clipboard. I had paperwork older than that kid's entire life proving it. Still, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flash a badge. I just nodded slowly, like a man considering bad advice, and told him I was going to finish my swim. That's when Karen stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She walked over like someone used to being obeyed, heels clicking against concrete, and informed me loud enough for nearby neighbors to hear that her son was giving me one last warning before she contacted the authorities. The irony nearly broke me. I asked her which authorities she had in mind. She said the county sheriff, the zoning board, and her lawyer, in that exact order, like it was a spell she'd cast many times before. A couple of neighbors peeked over fences. Phones came out. Karen loved an audience. Her son folded his arms, clearly enjoying his moment, clearly convinced that he was untouchable because of who his mother was. I could have ended it right there. I could have pulled the badge from my towel, shown them exactly who they were talking to. But years in law enforcement had taught me something valuable. People reveal far more when they think they're winning. So I told them both to go ahead. Call whoever you want. Karen smiled like Christmas had come early. She told her son to make the call. He dialed, pacing like he was already rehearsing the story. Angry homeowner, trespassing, refusal to comply. I watched him speak, nod, and glance back at me with that same smug confidence, completely unaware that he was currently requesting backup from my own department, from deputies who answered directly to me. When he hung up, he told me I had 10 minutes before I'd be escorted off the property in handcuffs. 10 minutes. I nodded again, stepped into the pool, and let the water close over my shoulders, calm as ever. Karen scoffed and announced to the gathering crowd that some people just don't know when they've re-beaten. I floated on my back, staring at the sky, listening to the distant siren growing closer, and thought about how funny it was that neither of them had asked the simplest question of all. Why a man like me, with this land, this pool, and this level of patience, wasn't even slightly worried. The sirens didn't rush in like Karen expected. They slowed as they turned onto the road, deliberate, and measured the kind of arrival. That meant the deputies already had context, and I could feel the shift before anyone else noticed it, that subtle change in the air when confidence starts leaking out of the loudest person in the room. Karen straightened immediately, smoothing her hair, practicing the expression she used when she spoke to people she believed were beneath her but still useful, while her son stood taller, clearly imagining himself as the hero of the story he'd soon be telling his friends, the one where he personally had a trespasser removed by law enforcement. The patrol vehicles rolled to a stop just outside my gate, gravel crunching softly, and 2 deputies stepped out, both of them men I'd worked with 4 years, both of them pausing the moment they saw me in the pool boots off to the side, towel on the chair, calm as a man on vacation. Their eyes flicked from me to Karen, then back to me again, and I saw the recognition hit like a dropped plate. One of them almost smiled before catching himself. Karen didn't notice. She rushed forward, heels clicking, voice already raised as she launched into her rehearsed speech about HOA authority, private amenities, trespassing violations, and a belligerent individual who refused to comply with lawful instructions. She pointed dramatically toward the pool, as if unveiling a criminal mastermind instead of a man floating peacefully in his own water. Her son chimed in, adding details that got bigger and more dramatic with every sentence: how I'd been aggressive, how I'd ignored warnings, how I'd threatened legal action like that was somehow a crime. The deputies listened politely, but I could see it in their posture. The slight tilt of the head, the way one of them folded his arms, not in authority, but in restraint.
Ow.
When Karen finally paused for breath, one of the deputies asked a single, devastating question: "Ma'am, whose property is this?" Karen laughed, actually laughed, and waved her hand dismissively, saying it was irrelevant because the HOA governed the entire development and that I was clearly violating multiple codes. The deputy nodded slowly and asked again, firmer this time, emphasizing the word property. Karen's smile faltered just a fraction. She gestured vaguely toward the surrounding homes, insisting it was community-adjacent land. That's when I stood up in the pool, water dripping down, grabbed my towel, and walked calmly toward them. The crowd leaned in, phones rose higher. Karen's son took a step back, suddenly unsure, introduced myself not loudly, not dramatically, just my name, followed by my title, spoken the same way I'd said it 1,000 times before in briefing rooms and courtrooms. Sheriff. The word didn't echo. It didn't need to. It landed heavy, like a dropped weight. One of the deputies immediately nodded and said, "Yes, sir," without thinking, pure muscle memory. And Karen's face went pale so fast it was almost impressive. The son's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like his brain was desperately rebooting. Karen tried to recover, tried to laugh it off, saying titles didn't matter and that the HOA still had jurisdiction. And it was when the second deputy gently but very clearly explained that this land was not part of the HOA, that it had been excluded during the original development zoning, and that all previous complaints filed against me, every single one, Karen had proudly submitted, had already been reviewed and dismissed. I watched her process that information in real time, the way her confidence collapsed inward, replaced by irritation, then confusion, then fear. She snapped that this was impossible, demanded to know why she hadn't been informed, and accused the deputies of favoritism. That accusation didn't land the way she hoped. The first deputy calmly reminded her that filing false or misleading complaints was itself a violation of county ordinance, especially when done repeatedly, and that wasting emergency resources carried penalties. Her son interrupted, insisting he'd been acting under HOA authority and therefore couldn't be held responsible. The deputy turned to him and explained slowly, patiently, that HOA authority does not supersede county law, property rights, or basic common sense. The kid's shoulders slumped. His mirrored sunglasses were suddenly gone, revealing wide, uncertain eyes. Karen wasn't done yet. She pivoted tactics, accusing me of intimidation, of abusing my position, of staging the whole thing. That was when I finally let a little edge into my voice, telling her that I hadn't called anyone, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't Done a single thing except stand on my own property and wait for her to demonstrate exactly why so many people had filed complaints about her behavior over the years. That hit harder than anything else. Neighbors murmured. Someone whispered complaints? Karen's head snapped around, scanning the crowd, realizing too late that her audience had turned from supporters into witnesses. One of the deputies pulled out a tablet and, with professional neutrality, informed her that she was being issued a formal warning for harassment and misuse of emergency services, and that further incidents could result in fines or legal action. Karen protested loudly, voice cracking now, demanding to speak to someone higher up. The deputy looked at me. I looked back at him. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Karen followed his gaze, and the realization finally, fully catastrophically settled in. Her son looked like he might be sick. The authority he'd borrowed evaporated instantly, leaving him exposed and embarrassed in front of everyone. I told them both, calmly and clearly, that they were no longer welcome on my property, and that any future attempts to interfere would be documented and handled formally. Karen didn't argue anymore. She gathered her things in stiff, jerky motions, muttering about lawyers and injustice, while her son avoided eye contact with anyone, especially me. As they left, the crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with quiet satisfaction. And one of the deputies leaned in and said under his breath, "You handled that better than I would have, sir." I smiled, thanked them, and watched the patrol cars drive away, knowing full well that this was in tea over not, even close, but also knowing that the balance of power had just shifted in a way Karen had never experienced before. Karen didn't retreat quietly after that day, even though she told herself she had no choice. People like her never believe they've lost. They just convince themselves the battlefield has changed. And within a week, the neighborhood felt different in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, like pressure building behind walls that had been solid for years. The HOA newsletters stopped mentioning my property altogether, which in itself was suspicious. But the complaints didn't stop. They just got sneakier. Anonymous notes appeared on my gate accusing me of intimidating residents. Emails circulated warning neighbors to be cautious around me, implying danger without ever saying it outright. Karen never put her name on anything anymore, but she didn't need to. Her fingerprints were all over it. What she hadn't realized was that the deputies were the only ones who noticed her behavior that day. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before started waving, stopping by the fence, quietly thanking me for standing up to her. One older man admitted she'd fined him 3 times in 1 month for parking his truck crooked. A single mother said Karen threatened to report her to child services because her kids left bikes on the lawn. Story after story poured out, each one worse than the last. And with every conversation I understood something. Karen never had authority only lasts as long as people are afraid to question it. The tipping point came when Karen's son, clearly still trying to reclaim some sense of importance, began enforcing HOA rules again, this time targeting people he thought were weaker than me. He confronted a teenage boy for fishing near the retention pond, grabbed the kid's phone when he tried to record, and called the sheriff's office himself, demanding they deal with the delinquent. That call landed on my desk. I listened to the recording twice, not because I needed to, but because it perfectly illustrated the problem. When the deputies arrived, they didn't just handle the situation, they documented it. Carefully, thoroughly, and for the first time, Karen's name appeared in an internal report, not as a complainant, but as a pattern. That opened doors she didn't know existed. A formal review of the HOA's practices began, triggered quietly, procedurally, without fanfare. Financial records were requested. Enforcement logs were examined. Selective fines became obvious almost immediately. Same violations. Different penalties, always harsher for anyone who had ever disagreed with her. Karen sensed something was wrong before anyone told her. She showed up at the county office unannounced, demanding meetings, throwing around legal threats that no longer carried weight. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, now sounded strained, brittle, cracking under the effort of maintaining control. Meanwhile, her son's behavior worsened, lashing out at neighbors, arguing in public, trying desperately to reclaim authority that had never really been his. One afternoon, he confronted me at the fence. No sunglasses this time, just raw anger and humiliation, accusing me of ruining his family, of abusing my position, of making his mother a target. I listened, arms folded, letting him say everything he needed to say, until the words ran out and all that was left was silence. Then I told him the truth calmly, without insult, that no one ruined his mother's reputation except her, and that power borrowed without responsibility always collapses eventually. He didn't respond. He just walked away, shoulders hunched, finally looking his age. The review moved faster after that. A special HOA meeting was announced, mandatory attendance with a county mediator present. Karen tried to spin it as routine. No one believed her. The room was packed that night, more residents than had shown up in years. And for the first time, Karen wasn't seated at the front like a ruler. She was just another person at the table. One by one, people spoke. Calmly, clearly. They described fines, threats, intimidation, selective enforcement, and retaliation. Karen interrupted constantly at first, scoffing, rolling her eyes, trying to assert dominance, until the mediator warned her that further disruptions would remove her from the meeting entirely. That silenced her. When the evidence was presented, documents, recordings, emails, her confidence collapsed in stages, each one more visible than the last. By the time the vote was called to suspend her pending further investigation, she looked genuinely stunned, like someone watching a world she thought permanent crumble in real time. The motion passed overwhelmingly. Her son stormed out before it was finished. Karen stayed seated, frozen, staring straight ahead as if movement itself might make it real. I didn't speak that night. I didn't need to. Sometimes justice doesn't require a voice. It just needs space to finally be heard. The weeks after Karen's suspension were quieter than the neighborhood had been in years, not because nothing was happening, but because the noise of intimidation had finally stopped, and in that silence, people began to notice just how heavy it had been all along. The county investigation didn't rush, and it didn't need to. Everything Karen had built her power on was already unraveling on its own. The financial audit revealed misallocated HOA funds, not stolen in the dramatic sense she'd later claim, but redirected in ways that benefited her friends and punished her critics. Legal on paper only if you squinted hard enough and ignored intent entirely. Selective enforcement was formally confirmed. Several fines were overturned. Refunds were issued. Letters of apology were sent out by the HOA board. Letters Karen had no hand in writing. She tried to fight it at first, hiring an attorney who spoke confidently until the full scope of documentation was laid out. At which point the conversations grew shorter and the invoices grew longer. Her son withdrew from public view almost entirely, no longer patrolling sidewalks or confronting neighbors. The bravado replaced by the uncomfortable realization that borrowed authority vanishes the moment its source collapses. One afternoon, months after the pool incident, Karen came to my gate alone. No clipboard, no sunglasses, no audience. She stood there for a long moment before speaking, and when she did, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, not apologetic, exactly, but stripped of certainty. She said she hadn't meant for things to go that far, that she'd only wanted order, that people didn't respect rules anymore. I listened without interrupting, not because I owed her that courtesy, but because it was the first time she wasn't performing. When she finished, I told her something she clearly hadn't expected: that rules without fairness aren't order. They're control, and control always breeds resistance. I didn't threaten her. I didn't lecture her. I just told her that the neighborhood would move on, with or without her, and that the best thing she could do was let it. She nodded, once, stiffly, and walked away, her footsteps slower than they used to be. By the end of the investigation, Karen resigned from the HOA permanently. The board was restructured. New bylaws were written with transparency baked in instead of authority assumed. Attendance at meetings dropped not because people stopped caring, but because they no longer had to be on guard. Kids played outside again without being monitored. Neighbors talked over fences instead of whispering. As for me, I went back to being just another guy in the neighborhood most days, swimming in my pool, maintaining my land, doing my job when the badge was on, and enjoying my peace when it wasn't. Every now and then, someone new moves in and asks about the HOA, and someone else will smile and say, "It's different now," without ever mentioning names. That's how it should be. Power doesn't announce itself when it's done right. And justice doesn't always come with handcuffs or courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives quietly. When the people who were afraid finally realize they don't have to be anymore. And every time I float on my back in that pool, watching the sky drift by, I am reminded of one simple truth Karen and her son learned the hard way. Real authority doesn't come from shouting orders or hiding behind titles. It comes from knowing when you rewrite, standing firm, and letting others expose themselves when they forget where their power actually ends.